Buongiorno Mondo, and welcome back to 15 with Fosca, the podcast. I am delighted to have as my guest here today, Eleanor Walker. Buongiorno, Eleanor.
Buongiorno.
How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm really good, thank you.
Good, and I'm especially excited because I believe you're my first guest from the UK.
Oh, I'm happy to represent.
Exactly. So first, I've been saying since I started the podcast, I've wanted to have you on because you have such a beautiful voice and such a beautiful accent. So finally, I have a guest from the UK who can share her story with us.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought actually the best way to begin today would be to ask you about your arrival here. So why are you in Italy? When did you come? And tell us more about your journey here.
Yeah, so I came in the summer of 2020, so July 31st, or 31st of July, 2020. And I came really to heal. I'd had a very difficult pandemic. As you know, I'm sure everybody had a really difficult pandemic, but mine was a particularly difficult one. And I was with my parents in June 2020, and my parents actually said, you need to go and learn how to live again, go and have a great time, like go to Italy, you love Italy. Because at this moment I was working in the luxury travel sector and I was on furlough in the UK where the government basically pays for your salary because you physically couldn't do your job because of all the restrictions. And on top of that, all of my travel clients were from the US coming to Italy, or not to Italy, but to Europe. So, of course, there was no one going on. Right. So I was sort of gradually, losing my brain a little bit because I had no occupation. And so I said, yeah, I'm going to go to Italy. And there was an opera or classical music festival that we had been to for a few years, which was called the New Generation Festival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it prided itself on supporting young people in the arts. So I think maybe 90% of the team were young professionals. So be it young singers who were really at the beginning of their career, had finished their training, were still, had, established young careers, but, needed some time on the stage. The entire team behind as well, backstage, were all young professionals. And I was given a contact when I asked, who do I speak to for volunteering?
Right.
And I sent an email and I said, look, I'm on furlough. I'd love to come to Italy. I've been to this festival. Can I volunteer? You don't need to pay me. I just really need something to do. And this seems great. And I've really, loved coming the last couple of years. And later that day, I got a call, and the guy who's running it with two other people, he's called Frankie, and he was like, "Can you get here in 2 weeks?"
No.
It's like, So anyway, so I was very, very lucky. Again, with the pandemic, I managed to find a flat. So I came and I worked with this festival, and it was honestly the most joyous thing. Because everybody had been so affected, singers, musicians, anybody in the arts.
It's terrible for everyone in the arts.
Everybody.
Everything stopped.
Everything stopped.
Yeah.
Everyone had been out of business, and this was the first thing that everyone was doing together since the world had shut down in March 2020. So there was tension, sure, and we had to wear masks, and there was COVID tests, and we didn't have vaccines or anything then. We barely had tests at that point, so it was tense. And, as soon as someone had any kind of symptoms, it was isolation immediately. Yeah. Unless you were singing, you had to wear a mask, and it was 40 degrees. So anyway, but it was still the most joyous thing, because we were kind of expecting to be shut down the next day, each day. But somehow we pulled it off, and it was in the Bobbly Gardens. It was great. So that was August.
Okay.
And my plan was to stay in Italy until I was due to go back to work on the 1st of November, because that was when the furlough scheme was due to end.
Okay.
So I thought, okay, fine, I'm going to stay. I don't need to be back in London. I'm going to stay out here. I'll do some Italian classes, visit some museums, live, a life of leisure in Italy, because why not? And then, at the end of September, just on the same week as my birthday, actually, my boss from London called me, and he was like, look, due to the way that the furlough is changing, we're really sorry, but we can't afford to keep you. because travel was still on its knees.
Yeah.
Like, there was no way there was going to be more travel in the winter of 2020
No,
to
and
21.
also things kept, stopping and like nobody had any idea. It was just confusion.
Yeah, it was
and
confusion, and like even travelers were scared of traveling.
Right.
We were scared of taking people aboard because we didn't know if something
Nobody
happened.
knew. Right, nobody knew what to do. We were all just kind of like following some kind of very unpredictable rules because they would change every day.
It would change every day. We were traveling between countries. They would change. Quarantine rules, isolation rules, and also my clients came from different parts of the US. So it was just so complicated. So my boss, it was really heartbreaking because I could hear the heartbreak in his voice because, it was his company and it had been, cut down so badly. It's still alive. It's alive. It survived. But yeah, and I was like, thank you so much for supporting me so far. Obviously I'm gutted, but, I'm not surprised either because I could see this coming. And so during this month, in the background, I had joined a choir.
Right.
And because I thought, there was a sign on the door saying, "Do you like to sing?" And I thought, yes. And so I joined this choir. I say choir, again, pandemic, so there were 4 of us. It was very small.
It was a quartet.
It was a quartet, and of that quartet was, the organist and the music director. So we were tiny, but we were all quite young, and I was like, this is a great way for me to meet people, because there was, I didn't really know how to meet people. And so when I was made redundant, I was having a chat with the chaplain in the pub after rehearsal one night. And I was like, kind of sucks because I loved my job and I loved my life in London and I loved my flat. I finally got the flat of my, my early 30s.
It's impossible to do, right?
Yeah, and I was living in a beautiful, on the canal in Little Venice and like everything, if you'd imagine my life, I was like, tick, 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 this is what I had. Anyway, and he was like, well, we have a job and we can't really pay very much, but we can give you a place to live for free.
This was at St. Mark's.
This is at St. Mark's.
Which is the English church for those who don't know out there, and maybe you can talk about them for a minute or two.
Yeah, sure. So English church, different from the American church. So they're on Via Maggio, and they're known for their music because the Anglican choral tradition is very unique to England, and it's even more unique to have it in Italy. Yeah. And it had been well established there by the previous chaplain, Father William, who was a big, he really enjoyed English choral music, and he had this whole program of having young, recent graduates or pre-graduates, usually Oxford, Cambridge, because they're very well conditioned with the English choral tradition, but not all the time. Sometimes there was one who came from Australia and things like this. Anyway, and pre-Brexit, you'd have someone come for a year and like be a young kind of injection into what is an aging congregation.
Right. So like an artist in residence type thing, which is lovely.
Exactly, and as a result, the choir is made up primarily, not exclusively, definitely not exclusively, but primarily of people in their 20s and 30s. And then, it's not that that's a rule, but that's kind of what has happened.
Okay.
And so, I've sung all my life, and so I joined, and it was like, well, this is great, this is fun. And this offer came for the job, and I remember actually, whenever I think about it, everyone goes, oh, that's an easy decision, right? You go to Italy. Yeah, you've got to remember it's the pandemic. I'm moving to a country on my own.
Actually, I think now that you're I knew that you had come during the pandemic.
Yeah.
But I don't think I had ever stopped up until now to think about the actual time when you came, what I was living. That was the first summer. Yeah. And I remember we did go on vacation as a family in August of that pandemic summer. Yeah. But we were only allowed like very little wiggle room. Yeah. Italy was probably one of the worst places in the world to be, also because it was so restrictive. Yeah. And it wasn't like that in the UK. No, and it certainly wasn't like that in the US. No. So anyway, so you come and you find yourself, but you get lucky.
I get really, really lucky. So I so this job was offered to me, and it was like, I had to swallow my pride a little bit because it was really not a lot of money. It was, it was basically enough to buy food each week.
Yeah, just to survive.
Just to survive. And I was like, wow, I'd finally got to a salary that I liked. And when as soon as you think your life is finally, you've made it and you've worked in the arts all through your 20s, and you're like, finally I've got something that really gives me joy. And it's on a okay salary for London, but the salary that you could, live
You
well.
could live on. Yeah.
And so I had to really swallow my pride and think, okay, I'm not going to be earning a lot, but what else do I get? And I actually talked to my uncle a lot about it, because my uncle is not involved in the arts at all, can be really objective. He has lived in Australia, is practically Australian. He's very cynical about things. And so he's a great sounding board. Yeah. And he was like, well, what have you got to lose? He's like, you're going to have to move out of London, full stop, because you can't afford to live there.
Yeah.
Do you want to go live with your parents? And I love my parents. I get on with my parents very well.
Of course.
But I haven't lived at home really since I was 14. I went to boarding school. And home is always really special for me. And I love it. But I protect it as a place of peace.
Yeah, I see that. And you didn't want to go back home. I get that.
Yeah. And, so he said, well, why don't you ask for a probationary period until Christmas? And if you're really unhappy with it, you can just go home at Christmas, because it's Christmas. Right? Didn't say Christmas 2020 in that.
Which Christmas did it end up being, right?
Yeah. So anyway, and so I decided to jump. I was like, okay, I'm going to leave, I'm going to jump, I'm going to try this and see what happens, because quite frankly, I actually don't have a lot of options right now. And I've always wanted to, live for longer in Italy. I had a study abroad here, and I've always loved it.
And the thing that we haven't talked about yet is that you're an art historian.
Yes,
right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of like, by the way.
But the weird thing is,
it made sense for you, though, to be here. You were working in luxury travel.
Yeah.
You had studied art history. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to go to, anywhere in the world.
Sure.
There was a reason. There was a connection to Italy already. There was a connection to the art. There was this arts festival, so there were all these other things that made sense for you.
Yeah, so my master's was looking at like Florentine, 15th century, looking at like Netherlandish art in Florence in the 15th century, so I had this connection with the city already, so it didn't feel like so much of a jump. I wasn't going into this new environment.
Right. I
was somewhat familiar with the city as a tourist. Or a student, really.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I jumped, and actually leaving London, my heart broke a bit. I remember crying when I left my flat. And I remember I couldn't pack my room. My brother had to come over and pack all my things. It was, I talk about this experience of moving, and it's always your heart is split in two, because you feel so at home in two places. And so, anyway, so I jumped, and I didn't go home at Christmas because I couldn't go home at Christmas. We decided to stay. So we had, this whole kind of drama of, the red zone, or orange, yellow, red,
it was so
traffic
complicated.
lights.
Yeah, there were all these.
Yeah.
It was really hard to keep up. It was tiring.
It was tiring. It was exhausting.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I remember I had planned to go home. I think I had even booked flights, and then because things were so bad, my brother had just had a son, my parents are vulnerable. We as a family decided not to come together. And we stayed apart. So we had, my mum had bought all the food, so she had to put the turkey in the freezer. My brother and sister-in-law had bought no food because they were due to go to my parents.
Right, and they had a newborn.
Yeah, and they had a newborn. So they ended up having, Domino's pizza on Christmas Day.
Oh, no.
I was the luckiest because I had, this community at St. Mark's.
Yeah.
So that was part of the reason why I thought it was a good place to live, because you have this community around you. You had, I was looking after all sorts of, the flats were empty at this point, but there were 7 flats there. And so I was looking after anybody who was living in that building as a resident, but also, we were there, all of us together, and this sort of, we look back at it quite fondly now, but we were lucky. We had 6 of us for Christmas dinner, and we had, an Italian who made us Christmas Eve dinner.
Oh.
So I probably was the luckiest out of my family that Christmas. Yeah. But I remember you could do exercise, I remember. And so I put on my joggers, and I went out into Florence on Christmas Day, Christmas morning. And I went up to, it was a grey, rainy morning, and I went up to Piazzale Michelangelo on like a bit of a jog run scenario. And I called my family from up there, and it was empty. It was completely empty. It was very surreal,
Yeah.
really surreal. And I remember seeing flashes of red everywhere. So I saw someone who had a red umbrella, someone who had a red bicycle, someone who had a red jumper. So I saw these flashes of red and I thought, oh, maybe there's slight sign of Christmas.
Right. Something's going on down there.
Because there weren't even really lights up.
No, it was so strange.
It was really weird.
Yeah.
We had a Christmas tree in the church, so that was nice. But we also didn't do any services because it was...
Couldn't.
So yeah.
Why did you, I mean, just like, so you're here.
Yeah.
And, well, you couldn't really go anywhere at that point. You're lucky because you do have this community. But, like, when things started to then normalize, and I know there's a lot to talk about, but, like, why did you stay?
Because I know this is probably quite a black and white way of putting it, but my career and my social life were balanced.
Okay.
So I thought, okay, if my career is balanced and my social life fulfills me, and both fulfill me, I've got no reason to leave.
Okay.
And I don't have to because I'm not on a visa. So I thought, I honestly, even to this day, take it year by year. I kind of reassess at the end of an academic year. Is everything kind of where I want it to be? Is it out of balance? If it's out of balance, how do I readdress? If it is readdressable, I stay. If it's not readdressable and I'm unhappy, there's no point me staying. Even though going home to England would also be heartbreaking, but, you know, because of many reasons, as we said before, you feel very at home in two very different places.
It's always hard because you always have, like, in an ideal world, we would be able to live, I say this often, but, you know, in both, like, somehow reconcile everything and be able to be very jet setting and live sort of half time here, half time there.
Sure.
But in the reality of, you know, today's world, that's just not really possible for many of us. But I like the fact that you have this very mature approach to it. Like, okay, let's look at how things are going for Eleanor right now. Okay, so professionally, personally, okay, things are looking good. We can stay another year. No, because I like that because it's actually a healthy thing, I think. Yeah. And I never did it because, I mean, I've always had doubts. I still have doubts, you know. Should I stay? I don't know. My life would be so much easier if I left.
I have those doubts too.
All the time. You know, so guess what? That won't change, you know,
Great.
whatever, 20 years from now. But I also think sometimes I look at the rest of the world and, you know, England, the U.S. included, and I just think, well, you know, right now there's so much chaos that maybe it's not a bad thing to stay put.
Yeah.
And especially if that, you know, at the end of the day, the checks and balances are okay, as you were saying.
Yeah.
But my looking at it from the outside, you know, and knowing you now, I mean, and knowing that you're strong and resilient and all that, but I don't know if I would have stayed. I have to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah.
Because I remember that time as being, on the one hand, very beautiful because I was able to spend time with my family, which is something that had never happened.
Yeah.
You know, I was still working, so I didn't feel a lot of the financial pressure that other people did. Luca was also still working, so we were okay. And we also had our kids with us, you know, and we were seeing each other. So I look at the pandemic as not necessarily a negative thing. So I wonder if maybe you also knew, I don't know, maybe you had this feeling of, hold on, something is right here, you know, something. Do you know what it was that made you stay? I mean, can you put your finger on it?
Probably two things. I guess the less romantic side of it was Brexit. So I was here pre-Brexit, so I was so lucky to be here.
So lucky.
I didn't even think this when I moved here, but I had to register as a resident in order to stay and work here without a visa.
Right.
Only in Italy, by the way. No, I'm like trapped in Italy.
Poor thing. You can't go to Spain. You have to stay here because of Brexit.
I can travel to Spain, but I can't work or live there.
To live here as a resident in Italy.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so part of me was like, look, this is the last chance I have to somewhat easily, I use easily loosely, to live here and work here and have a life for a little bit. Who knows how long, but for now I have this opportunity. Right. So let's see what I can do with it. Let's see if I can make it work. You know, so part of that was, you know, I do not want to give that up because I'm still bitter about Brexit and my European citizenship being taken away from me. So I was like, okay, I'm here, I've got this opportunity, let's see what I can do. I'm in the country that speaks to my, qualifications.
Exactly.
So if there's going to be any chance of doing anything, and bearing in mind, like I've always been, in the arts and in, art history, but I'd never taught art history before. I'd never taught before.
Okay.
I'd never been involved in education like that before. I'd been involved always with people and always talking with people and having very client-facing roles, but I'd never worked in education before. It's not something that I thought I would go into. And obviously, as you'll find out, I kind of headed that way. But I thought, okay, well, let's see. So part of it was kind of having this kind of golden opportunity.
Yeah.
And the other part of it was, England at that point, and kind of to a certain extent still, is quite a depressing place from my point of view with regards to careers, with regards to the arts. It has an amazing art scene, and there are so many opportunities for people there, but it's, from what I hear from people my age over there, it's a really depressing place, and it's really hard it still is really hard here to make a living in the arts, but in the UK there have been so many cuts to arts fundings, to, all these amazing institutions that obviously, I'm reading from an external point of view.
Sure.
And I'm sure, if I decide to go home, I would be able to find, a career in some way.
Of course.
But it's just, there's a quite, I can't really describe it. Every time I go, there's this sort of oppression that I feel, that I sort of think I'm not ready to fight that.
Right.
And I think a lot of it is still Brexit.
I was gonna say, because here, one could say about Italy, well, there are a lot of, problems.
Mm-hmm.
There are problems everywhere, but Italy is still, part of the European Union, and there is funding for the arts, and things are happening.
Yeah.
And if I look at a city like Florence and what's happened post-pandemic in terms of the art scene, and just in terms of any scene, like I think I saw a post yesterday where somebody was like, "Oh, I'm coming to Florence this summer. I'm interested in checking out some music. What website would you recommend?" I'm thinking, website? Like, girl, like you could basically on any given evening in Florence, there's something to do.
Yeah.
Whether it be music, art, dance, whatever. There's a lot going on considering how small a city it is.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying there's loads of money, but there is a lot going on. It's a dynamic scene. And so I can see how that was appealing to you, because I do think that Brexit left a very big hole in a number of areas.
Yeah.
But two of the biggest are education and the arts.
Yeah, and it's
really sad.
It's really sad, and I'm not. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that there's a halo around the EU and everything is perfect on the EU. I really don't. But I'm still, and I don't think the wound will ever really fully heal with that, because I really think it was such a poorly executed thing.
Yeah.
So I figured, I'm going to turn my back on it a little bit and see what I can do out here. It doesn't mean forever.
No,
it doesn't mean forever.
All my guests say that. It's so funny because all my guests are like, it doesn't mean forever now, 30 years later. But maybe that's a good thing. In other words, maybe not making, I think what the pandemic taught a lot of us is maybe it's not such a good idea to make long-term plans.
Yeah, and to be honest, I was here when there weren't many other, non-residents here. And so I thought, well, what better opportunity to maybe see if there's other jobs or other, projects I can be involved with. Okay, there's not a lot you can do in person, but, we got so equipped to doing things on Zoom and, and so that's, really what I was doing with the church as well. I was trying to do a sort of community outreach, cultural program for people, regardless of your faith, to try and have some community. Okay, it's all online, and now it's all in person again, but try and have book group. Like I started a book club, which I soon discovered is a very English thing. Book clubs I discovered isn't really an Italian thing. And so, you know, having a book club online, or I think we did yoga, you know, as on hybrid as well. So there were things that we did to try and create that community, which was so needed. So even though being here was a very surreal experience and difficult in many ways, there was also opportunity in which to be like, okay, so this is the scenario we find ourselves in, where can I fit in? So, you know, I ended up working a bit with the British Institute when they were doing stuff with their website, and that was, you know, short-term, kind of only ever short-term project, but it was great because I had that with the church. They're right next to one another practically, you know, and then the rest is sort of history. I managed to, because also I think because there were so few people here, you made connections very quickly.
I was thinking about that as well, because you know, every time you talk about the church, and you just talked about the British Institute, and I just saw the empty streets.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's hard, you know, now when, you know, I'm walking down Via Maggio, you know, there's a line around the block for Gusta Pizza, or you can't, and you know, you can't walk anywhere, you know, and that's been basically the reality of Florence since, you know, since doors were opened again and people started traveling again. So that's why I was saying it's not all bad when I think back to that time. And so maybe, you know, you had this, you know, a lot of people, whether they be my clients or newcomers to Florence, or even people who've been here for a long time, often ask me about community. Like, how do you find community? How do you build community? And I think you were very fortunate because, you know, both the British Institute and St. Mark's are important magnets for the city, not only for the expat community, but also I think they're points of reference for Florentines as well. And so you kind of fell into those two places, and I think that really did help you build a community, find things, and make deeper connections, just because also I think people were lonely. You know, and so Florence was empty. It's very hard for people to understand, like, especially in the extreme downtown. I think, like, in my neighborhood in Porta Romana, in other more residential areas, I don't think it was that bad because people were still walking around, you know, and going and buying their groceries or, you know, going to the pharmacy. But in the really, like, touristy neighborhoods, it was a ghost town.
I remember walking around and, you know, first of all, I remember when I came in that summer and it was a little bit busier. I remember really only hearing European languages, which was a change because I remember coming previous to the pandemic and hearing, you know, quite a lot of American, because there's a lot of Americans that love to come here. You know, always have been.
A lot of Asians.
Huge
tourism from the East,
Exactly. And when I came, I really only heard maybe some French and some German and Italian. And I remember being like, oh, this is really, like, audibly it feels very different.
And it was different. I wanted to just, like, reconfirm that because no students.
No students. It was really bizarre.
It's crazy. No tourists and no students.
And I remember saying this to the two guys who were working at the church, the director of music, Scott Phillips, and James Short, who was the organist at the time, who were both new to Florence, or both British, you know, both incredible musicians. And I said to them, guys, this is really unusual. Like, try and take this in because it's never going to be like this again. And it's really, really unusual. But, you know, going back to the idea of community, there weren't so many people here. So you just kind of, you know, you met other people who were who were in the city, and you're like, so what are you doing here? How are you here?
It was all very weird, you know? Okay, so we finally come out of it, though.
Yes.
All right. And so at this point, what trajectory does your life take?
So I was still kind of working at the church, and I worked at the church until 2022.
Okay.
And in 2020, and I'm still, you know, I still sing with them. They're a great source of community for me. But in 2021, I think it was 2021, they all kind of, and I'm sure this is for everyone, it all kind of blurs into this weird period of time. But I think it was 2021. I was looking for other roles to substitute my work at the church because I was working. Theoretically, I was supposed to be working, you know, each morning about 20 hours. I mean, I was working around the clock at the church, but I needed something else to supplement. And I found this position at Stanford University.
Well, and I guess that's how we met.
And that's how we met. So I actually went for a different position and I didn't hear anything back.
I remember.
And I emailed to ask for feedback because I always chase for feedback.
Right.
I've been told by my parents that it's always good to chase because it just reminds them that you
Right.
still exist as a
Right.
human being. And
You applied for an admin position.
I applied for
now I'm remembering
I applied
it.
for an admin
Okay.
position, and I got a reply saying, "Sorry, the position's been filled, but please come in. There might be another position
Right.
for you." So I thought, okay, great. So I came in, and I think I had the fastest interview of my life because it was all pandemic as well. We were in.
Right.
We had to be.
Did I interview that you
You
too? I was
yeah,
there.
you
I was
were-
there too. I remember.
You were there with me, and we were out. We had the interview on the terrace, outside.
Yeah, now I remember. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, wait. Yeah. Now I
Because
remember.
we could demask
Right,
there,
right.
so and still stay distance.
Right.
And I remember, God, it was. I had this huge panic attack because I was outside and my green pass wouldn't scan because literally 2 days before I had my vaccine.
Oh, right. I remember because we
Yeah.
talked about that.
Yeah,
When
so
you came in.
I
Wait,
came
so
in.
there was some, and then.
So basically, I think I'd had my booster,
Yeah.
and my green pass, whatever it was, I
Right.
think it was called green pass,
Yeah.
hadn't updated. So because it basically showed that my vaccine was out of date, but
Right.
I'd had 2 jabs, not one,
Right.
and so it wasn't scanning. And I remember a colleague of ours at the time was like, "I can't let you in if it doesn't
I
scan
remember.
green," and I was like, "I've got the bruise on my arm. I can show you."
I remember that so well.
Oh,
I
God.
completely forgotten about
I was
all
so
of that.
tense.
We had to do now that you remind me.
Yeah.
So when was that? Was 2021?
It was
Spring
2021.
2021.
Yeah.
Summery, like this time of year.
Yeah, a little early. I think like March.
Yeah.
It must have been like
And
February,
then
March.
you started in the fall.
I started, I started in the fall, 21.
I had completely forgotten because then now it's all coming back to me because I had forgotten about
the temperature
green
check.
pass, the temperature at
Yeah.
the entrance we couldn't let anyone in, and I remember how many times I was like, I'm sorry, I can't
Yeah.
let you in.
Yeah, so I remember
But you
panicking.
did get in. It worked.
Yeah, because I had to delete the app and
then
re-upload it.
reinstall. Oh my gosh! Before a job interview, can you imagine? I had no idea.
Always be early for your job
Right,
interviews.
right.
Thank you once again for tuning in to this week's episode of 15 with Fosca and for continuing to do so. Grazie mille e alla prossima volta.